Welcome to Miniature Painting, and today we're going to turn a Disney toy from McDonald's into a copper statue with verdigris for your terrain. This is a long form video showing almost all steps for this piece. It's sped up to about twice speed with voiceover. If you like this format, please let me know and I'll make additional ones. So we have this that's going to end up becoming a piece of terrain, like a statue. This was a McDonald's toy, and it'll require a bit of modification to make sure it works out all right. See these lines right here? They don't really bother me. I'll just use them for weathering later on. And it comes with this roller on the bottom, so, since it was a toy. So we're going to start off with some super glue to hold it on. And then while that's drying, I'm going to go over the paints that we're going to use. So this is a new penny metallic craft paint. I have metallic paint made specially for models, but the point of using this toy was to try to reduce cost. So this is be a copper statue with some verdigris oxidation. So for that, we're going to use the Nilic Oxide from Citadel's technical range. And then I'm also going to be using Payne's Gray, Daler-Rowney FW acrylic ink. And then all of this is going to be in a dry palette due to using metallics and inks. So we're going to use the copper as both a base coat and as the highlight. It's pretty shiny, so it will actually do a really good highlight of itself. The Payne's Gray is going to be a nice cold shadow. Since the copper is so warm, you really want to use do the opposite with the shadows. And I'm going to start off with a size 3 brush when I'm painting this. And go ahead and start putting some paint on. Now you can see that I zenithal highlighted this model. This was actually the one that I did in my airbrushing video, if you remember that. And usually for a metallic, a zenithal highlight isn't, well, I won't say it's irrelevant, but it's really there more for a value sketch. I usually use a Vallejo metal color, which is pretty opaque, and you wouldn't be able to see a highlight through it, but the value sketching ahead of time helps you figure out kind of where the shadows and highlights are. In this case, the craft paint isn't as opaque and is actually showing the highlight through the first coat. And we'll definitely have to put on another coat after the first coat dries. So you can see I'm being kind of sloppy with this first base coat. Once I realized that I was going to have to really do a second coat in order to get the coverage I wanted, which was almost immediately, I didn't worry as much about getting the brush strokes and things like that on there, because a second coat is usually help hiding stuff from the first coat, but also in this case, this metallic, I was going to go back and forth with shadows quite a bit, so I wasn't as worried about brush strokes on this part. I was just kind of getting the paint on so that way it can dry and provide a good base coat for a second layer later on. So as you can see, I added a stick onto it. This is a craft stick just with some super glue and baking soda, so that it'd be easier to handle for the second coat. I also put on a glove, so I should have thought of that ahead of time, but it happens. Also, truthfully, I probably should have used a bigger brush for the base coat, but hey, you do what you do, right? So I like having terrain that is visually interesting, but I don't necessarily want to put in the amount of effort that I might for a typical model that would be the same size. So the terrain should really complement what's going on and tell a story, but the action should be focused on the models. Obviously, if this was like a diorama or a display piece, that would be a little bit different. But in this case, it's going to be visually appealing on the tabletop, and then it'll go onto a shelf or a drawer while it's between games. So it doesn't need to be the center of interest. Okay, now the base coat is done. We're going to let it dry and then come back. Okay, so now at this portion, once it's dry, I'm going to go in with this Payne's Gray from Daleroni. It's acrylic ink, and it's a really nice bluish black. I actually enjoy using it a lot. But the reason I'm using this one in particular is because the copper is a very warm color, and it's going to have very warm highlights. So if you have warm highlights, then you want cold shadows. And vice versa, if the highlights are cold, then you want warm shadows. And it's a way to increase contrast by using temperature of color. So I'm starting, and I'm being fairly messy with this ink. I'm running the brush just along each area here and showing where the shadows are going to be, but I'm not trying to be too careful. This obviously isn't the final shadows that I'm putting in. And while the metallic paint has its own highlights and shadows that will just kind of naturally be there whenever the model is sitting out somewhere, this helps to build additional contrast in true metallics. So obviously this is pretty nasty looking right now, but you have to work through the bad parts in order to get to the good. So always remember that you're going to make your model look terrible, but then the next step makes it look good, and you just keep doing that. So next I'm going to use a large makeup brush, in a dry brushing technique, but with the paint still quite wet. So the ink will still be wet on the model uh, because ink stays wet for a little while, and the copper is still fairly wet on the brush, and so they will actually blend together on the model. So this will help kind of keep the shadows fairly well defined with darkness, but blends them into the metallic color and gives the entire model a slightly aged look. You could go super heavy with this if you wanted the model to be really, really aged. But in this case, I'm using this to kind of define an area between the shadows and the highlights. Okay, so you can see now that all of the copper has like a nice patina to it. So now I'm going to go in with a smaller brush. I think this is probably a 0. And I'm going to use the Payne's Gray, and I'm going to be a little bit more careful in the areas that I decide to put it. I'm going to really focus on the areas of shadow and hit the nooks and crannies, but just not quite as sloppily as the last time. And the idea is I'm going to work the contrast back and forth, back and forth. You know, hit the ink, then the metallic, ink, metallic, in order to redefine each area and help really up the contrast between them. Now continuing on, I'm going to use the same small brush, and here I'm going to clean up the areas of highlight with the copper. So at this point, you could say I'm doing a little bit of blending, but really what I'm doing is I'm kind of reestablishing the areas of highlight. So I'm going to, basically the goal is to try to tone down the patina on the areas where it's going to get the most light there, and it's going to catch everything. Obviously, you know, you kind of have to define that for yourself. The real light that you'll see will depend on whatever the lights are in the area that the statue is, since it's true metallic. And so you just kind of have to make that up for yourself. And at this point, we'll end up with a blend between this pure copper highlight, the aged patina of the copper that we did, and the Payne's Gray. And really, in order to get the most contrast, what you can do is you work the highlight near the shadows, since that helps to provide a really good contrast between them. So this will go back and forth until you're happy with it. But at this point, I'm doing the areas with the deepest shadow and the Payne's gray. I really want to make sure that these are going to be the areas that define where your eye goes. And the good part about using an ink is that it's pretty glossy when it dries. So it still gives the impression of the object being metallic when it's in shadow. And then when I'm done with this step, the ink really needs to kind of settle down a little bit for my next step. I don't want them to blend very well when I do my highlights. So I'm going to let the ink dry for a few minutes and then I'm going to come back. Okay, so now at this point I'm going to use a smaller makeup brush and I'm really going to try to do my highlights. In case you're wondering, these are e.l.f. brushes. They're very inexpensive. You can get them at Walmart and most other stores. But in most cases, with this dry brushing technique, you would just dry brush to brush down, since that's how light hits the model. But in this case, since it's metal, I'm going to dry brush up also. I'm going to do it in both directions. Now, metal is obviously very reflective, or can be depending on the type of metal, and will reflect diffused light that comes off the ground. So light, bounces off the ground, hits the model from a downward angle also. And so you really have to think from where the light is coming from. As an example, there's an area between the legs underneath her dress cloak where you're not going to get any direct light and you're not going to get reflected light. So I'm not going to dry brush there. And then I'm also really focusing on the areas near shadows to get the most contrast. And this actually looks pretty well on this model too, because those also kind of happen to be areas that have the most elevation from the model. They poke out the most, and so it would kind of naturally catch the light anyway. So at this point, I'm pretty much done with just the statue. It has some really nice cold shadows that contrast well with the shiny highlights. And this is how you could do a pretty good looking piece of terrain, and you could totally stop at this point. It would be a new looking copper statue, or anything made out of copper. But what I'm going to do is I do want it to age a little bit, so I'm going to let the paint settle, and then I'm going to come back with some weathering. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to continue on with some weathering. I'm going to use Nelic Oxide from Citadel's technical paint range to replicate verdigris on the copper. A copper statue that stays outside is going to get oxidized. I mean, really anything that stays out long enough will have corrosion. I've seen copper bells which were outside for only a couple days and already had verdigris on them. and they got polished pretty often. So you want to look for areas that are actually going to get corroded. So random large flat spots, yeah, not so much. There's a few different ways to apply this, but I'm going to be fairly heavy on the head since that's the top. And then I'm going to have it pool in areas that water would collect, because that's kind of how verdigris reacts. It really uses water as a traveling mechanism. And then it will run down the model in areas that water travels. And once it's applied and it looks like it's gotten into the low areas, I take a paper towel and I just kind of rub it off the hot spots or the high spots. Although this looks like a Citadel shade, it doesn't behave quite the same, and you actually need to manhandle it a little bit. So if you wipe away a little too much, you can go back in and reapply to make it look the way you want it to. And if it doesn't look quite right, a wet brush can also help blend the nullic oxide in a little bit. So this model is basically done. I used one craft paint, one ink, and a technical paint, and it looks pretty good. So now I'm going to make something for it to stand on. Obviously, you wouldn't just throw this as it is out on a tabletop. I was originally thinking of a pedestal, but I don't think it would look quite right with the lower portion of the model, that kind of like wavy rock looking thing. You don't normally see those on pedestals. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put it on the ground, like in a park or a meadow. In Central Park, there is a statue of Alice in Wonderland that's, I think it's actually bronze, but it kind of has a similar look. And it's just kind of sitting out in the, on, might even be on concrete, but it's like you turn a corner and it's just there on the ground and kids climb on it and stuff like that. I kind of wanted to have that similar look, so that's what I'm going to go for next. I'm going to make the lower portion of this that it will actually sit on the tabletop. Okay, so this is a piece of foam core that I cut off. I didn't measure it, I just put the statue on it and said, yeah, that's good. And I'm going to go around and make it into a roughly oval shape and bevel the edges a little bit. That way it's not too abrupt on a tabletop. So it takes several passes to cut the foam core nicely. You want to be gentle and patient with it. If you're too impatient, you're going to rip it. If you try to cut it in one pass with just an old ass blade, you're going to make it look all raggedy. Now, sometimes that can actually be a kind of a neat effect. It does look fairly good sometimes for old crumbly stone or really old concrete that's kind of, concrete steps. They a lot of times break along the edges, and that can look like that. But in this case, it represents the ground, so I'm going to just try to make the edges look fairly nice. So now I'm going to put some texture on this base, and then I'm going to paint it and add the statue. But despite what this bag actually looks like, this is baking soda. I'm going to put on super glue, and then I'm going to use a crafting stick to spread it around. So then I just threw the baking soda on top and get rid of the excess. So the baking soda hardens the super glue almost instantly and can create a nice texture. And I'm going to do that around the entire base, leaving an area in the middle for the statue to sit. And you just want to make sure you use an old brush to brush off extra baking soda. Okay, so I took a break to clean up the workspace a little bit. Foam core is pretty delicate, so I'm actually going to use Mod Podge to prime and seal it. And you want to use a really old brush for this, an inexpensive brush. In this case, I'm using a brush that is normally 78 cents. That was an additional 75% off during an AC Moore store closing. So, I used to call them acid brushes, but I've never actually brushed acid, so I don't know where that name came from. And I'm going to use Mod Podge on all the exposed surfaces of the foam. And it works well because it seals it, and it actually will give it a little bit extra texture that works well with a kind of a natural look. Now you can over texturize a base since it needs an area for the statue to actually fit. So if you go crazy with texturizing and make this look like a mountain, it won't fit anywhere. But just a little bit something always looks nice. Okay, so I added a second coat of Mod Podge off camera, and you can see the texture when I put it up to the camera at an angle. And so now it's going to be time to paint this base. I want it to look like it actually has a pretty good soil, and then I'm going to add turf and flowers and that kind of stuff on top of it. So in order to get the look that I want here, I'm going to go through a few different paints. Again, I'm going to try to use some craft paint, but also what I have. So I have Daleroni FW Red Earth acrylic ink. I have a dark chocolate craft paint, a driftwood craft paint, and Agrax Earthshade, which is from Citadel. So I'm going to start with this darker brown, the dark chocolate craft paint, to apply a base coat to this. And once I started doing it, I noticed that the Mod Podge wasn't quite dry. Or maybe it was almost dry, but the wetness of the paint with my brushing had loosened it up. But I saw that they were mixing together all right, so I just went with it. And then you want to make sure that you also paint the edges around the side. Obviously, people talk about painting the edges of bases to make them look finished. And in this case, it's kind of the same thing. Having an unfinished edge is just quite jarring. It really, obviously, nobody thinks that this is real, right? But it just kind of throws off the look and looks like you didn't finish it. So I did a second coat of the dark chocolate craft paint off camera, and you can actually see the texture fairly well there. And so next I'm going to use the Red Earth ink from Daleroni, which will dry glossy and actually look kind of wet, and will help give it a varied look. You know, soil has clay and different things in it, so it's you want to have different looks. See, if it's just straight brown, it doesn't look real. So I don't want full coverage. You know, ink is relatively thin, so it's just kind of adding a red filter to the brown. So now I'm going to dry brush with the Driftwood craft paint. It's thicker than a modeling paint, so it lends itself to dry brushing. And I typically dry brush pretty heavy and kind of wet. So I'm really trying to control myself here. But I'm going to go over the areas that have the higher ridges and leave the flat areas. So this isn't going to be super noticeable, but it is it's a skosh lighter. So now I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade, and I'm also going to focus on the raised areas again so that it pools around the bottom of these ridges. Agrax Earthshade, or Liquid Talent as people call it, has always worked pretty well. But some people are really heavy with it and throw it everywhere. I like to be a little bit more judicious with it. That way it just doesn't look quite as dirty and samey, even though it is dirt in this case. I decided to come back and do a little more dry brushing with the sandalwood on the raised areas. I did that off camera. This does seem like quite a bit of work for what will probably be under flock or turf. But this hobby is actually very fluid. You might decide while you're putting the grass on that you want some bare spots, or the grass is thin and the ground shows through. Terrain isn't perfect, and putting in those types of things that you see in actual nature can really help sell the effect. So now I'm going to attach the statue itself to this base. I'm doing it now because I didn't want to get any of the soil paint onto this actual statue. I wanted it to be pretty clean. If you wanted it to look kind of like it had sunk into the ground, it was dirty, you could obviously put it on before you painted. So in this case, I'm going to use some super glue. First, I kind of figure out where you want to put it. You got to put it in a spot where it fits, but all right. And then I pressed it in a little bit just to. It still has some resiliency, but then it has a little tiny hole for that roller that's still on the bottom. So I used some PVA and super glue. The super glue obviously works pretty quickly. Most people are familiar with it. The PVA actually has a really good lasting hold. Like, it will hold on strongly over time. So combining them together works well for this type of object. PVA actually needs air in order to dry correctly. So you don't want to completely cover it. If you just slather the whole thing on, half of it will stay wet, and then it won't actually adhere to much of anything. So that's going to dry while we're putting on everything else. So the other things that I'm going to use is a Army Painter Woodland Tuft and Army Painter Meadow Flowers. So this is a statue of a lady in a dress. So ordinarily you would consider her to be good, in the morality good versus evil of these types of games. She would be considered good. So good people should usually have things like flowers or other objects that kind of represent wholesomeness and things like that, and that those link into her base. So they kind of show that, hey, she's a good person. Especially since the statue itself is whole, right? If it was broken, old, ruined, things like that, then I might put in some skulls, broken pieces of weapons, things like that. But in this case, we use flowers because they help give that illusion of her being a good person, and that it's a kind of an idyllic scene. So this woodland tuft, this dark grass will often grow up around objects like fences at your house. So the grass gets protected and grows pretty well. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it somewhat around the side of the statue, and it'll also help hold that gap. Now for the grass that's out on the base, I'm going to use Woodland Scenic light and medium green turf, since they kind of match the Army Painter Meadow Flowers and the Woodland Tuft, respectively. Obviously, no area of grass is just exactly the same, so I'm not going to use just one color. But I also don't want to combine them 50-50 either, because what will happen is that then they're really well mixed, and you won't be able to see one or the other. And grass just doesn't look like that. You don't have two species that just grow in perfect harmony with each other. So there'll be areas of both, and there'll be areas of kind of combination where they come together, and they'll look nice. So, just look at nature around you, and you'll see dark grass, brown grass, bare spots, and those just come from, shading, where they can't get the light, weeds that are attacking them, other invasive plants, people walking, if you keep walking in the same area, like maybe up to a statue to look at it, it's going to get kind of worn down over time. Dogs that always go piss in the same area, that kind of stuff. All that kind of stuff works together. So I'm going to start with the Army Painter Woodland Tufts. I actually really like these. I like these Army Painter little tufts of grass anyway. Anytime I'm at a friendly local gaming store and they have one, I usually pick one up. And that way I can support the store. They may not carry other things that I want, but I can build up a nice supply in my basing and terrain drawer. And you don't have to worry about them going bad. You don't have to shake them before you put them on or anything like that. The statue actually had a hole in the back that came with it from the McDonald's where I bought it. And I didn't want to fill it in with a bunch of green stuff. So in this case, what I did was I put a large tuft of grass, and it kind of gives the appearance of it starting to climb up the back, especially, obviously the front is the focal point of interest. So over time, grass is going to kind of grow up around the back if people aren't taking care of it. So I also like these meadow flowers. It breaks up the lines a little bit and makes it a little bit more interesting to look at. I kind of, at this point, I think it's probably pretty good, but I might throw in some larger pieces out and around. So at this point, I'm kind of deciding where exactly I want to put each type of turf. And if you're really working with flock or turf, you should put something down underneath it, a piece of newspaper, although I don't think I have actually gotten a newspaper in a few years. In this case, I'll just put down a piece of paper, and that helps with cleanup. But also later on, when you're kind of trying to get some combination together, um, you'll see that you'll have some that have already been pre-mixed on the paper for you. So when you put down turf and flock, you pretty much just pinch it and then press it into the glue, and you'll end up having some excess that you can just lightly wipe onto the paper, and also give the model itself a few taps and get rid of some of the loose stuff. That way you get a lot of it into the glue and it will soak into it and hopefully adhere most of it, but you'll end up having some loose stuff, and then you can kind of reapply later. Or if it gives you a good look of maybe some grass that's establishing itself or maybe dying off, and then you can use that as an area where you can kind of see the ground through it. And you can see paper really helps with cleaning this up, otherwise it just kind of goes everywhere. So I'm going to switch over to a more saturated green color now. And what I do is I just pick a place near the part where I already have grass, but it's still where I want to put the more saturated, and I will put some glue and then put the original color down, so the less saturated, and then add the new one on top of it, so that way it looks like an area where they're kind of, the two grasses are fighting it out, or they're commingling together. And then work from just put progressively more and more of whatever grass you're switching to. And the good part about completely painting the base to look like dirt is that I can choose to leave a gap or have poor coverage, and it just looks right. It looks real. Although, real is very subjective. What I think looks real may not look real to somebody else, but everybody has their thing that they kind of care for. And you can see I use a few different methods here in order to actually try to get the loose grass off. I just hate when flock grass, tough, static grass, whatever, comes off while you're playing or something like that. I like it to, obviously if you drop it and it breaks, it's different, but if you're just kind of playing and stuff's always falling off, I think it looks kind of crappy. So I try to get all the excess off that I can. And then with that excess, as I said, you have a good mixture on the paper of both colors. So you can go through areas where more came off than you really wanted and you'd like to kind of reestablish it. You put a few drops of PVA in there, and you can take that mixture and pinch it into those areas and fill them in and get a little look of them, again, fighting it out there in the against each other. Once you have the grass kind of how you like it, you just end up letting the PVA dry. Try to let it dry completely. So the way I always finish off these ground coverings, I will get a plastic grocery bag from, the grocery store, Walmart, Target, whatever. And I put it inside of that, and the reason will be apparent in a second. And then I will actually blow on all the grassy areas with air through the airbrush. And that way I can really get all the stuff off that's not sticking well. The bag helps to keep it from just kind of blowing everywhere. And then, since I'm using the airbrush, I will spray it down with varnish to help hold everything on that's adhered with the PVA. In this case, I'm using AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. I use it just the exact same as you would use paint on through the airbrush. And I make sure that I don't spray the statue. That way it keeps the shine that it originally has from the metallic paint. Obviously, if you spray it down with the matte, it will get rid of the shine. And after blowing off all the excess turf, you might find that there are spots that you'd like to reinforce with more grass, like maybe, it just wasn't sticking and you decide to reapply it. That's okay. That's actually what I decided to do. After varnishing, there was a few spots that I was like, well, this is a little bare. I'd like to add some more in, so I added more grass in after I was done varnishing it. So I'll take it out of the bag a couple of times and you'll be able to see it. And after adding that grass on, I called it done. I'm really happy with this train, and particularly the verdigris effect on the copper. I think that turned out really well. It took about 2 hours worth of work, not including drying time. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and found something that you can use. If you liked it, you can follow me on Instagram at minipaints and visit my Facebook page at miniature painting. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.